What does it cost you to stay in a life that has stopped making room for you to grow? Now, I don't mean that as a philosophical or an emotional question. I mean it really is a practical one because, well, most of us can feel the cost of stagnation. We just really tend to avoid confronting it. What would it mean to you to change the dynamic when everything that you've built over the years, your whole identity is really nagging you to stay? The pension is there, the salary is there, the title is there, but your heart and perhaps your health are telling you an entirely different story. And I want to tell you a story about a man who faced that question really head on, and in circumstances that make our situations look very manageable indeed. That man's name was Maurice. Maurice was my dad. And when my dad made his choice, well, he was already seriously ill. In fact, he'd been seriously ill for years. He never once complained about it, not once, in 14 years. What he did instead is what I want to share with you today. My dad was a corporate economist for a nationalised industry in the UK. One of his main jobs every year was to draw up a 10-year and then review the 10-year economic plan. Those 10 years were documented, they were justified, they were presented. Now, my dad was good at forecasting like that. He was respected for his practicality, but nevertheless, every 3 or 4 years, the government changed. And with a new government came a new direction. And with the new direction came new priorities. And new priorities, well, they needed a new 10-year plan. And so the plan that Dad had spent months constructing so carefully would get torn to shreds. Literally, imagine having your prize skill that you've spent months working on every 3 or 4 years being totally torn to shreds. Now, Dad, he went through that cycle for years. And despite that skill, he found out that he'd risen as far as this particular corporate ladder would allow him to rise. Now, that experience, I think, taught him something about the nature of security that most people only learn when something much more brutal intervenes. Now, in my dad's case, that brutal something was total kidney failure. I was about 9 or 10 years old when my father nearly died for the first time. His kidneys finally failed when we were on holiday, in fact, on the island of Elba. Now, ironically enough, Elba was the scene of one of Napoleon's exiles, and also my dad's sudden exile in what was basically a peasant hospital. Now, even though I was young, I understood the gravity of what was happening. When my dad made it back to the UK, well, the atmosphere inside our house was totally changed. Dad nearly died, then he didn't die, then he nearly died again. Over and over with variations for the next 14 years. My dad and we as a family learned to adapt to his life-threatening kidney disease, dialysis first, and then one of the world's first successful kidney transplant patients. Now imagine what that means as a family. Dad goes to hospital. Dad comes back. Dad goes to the hospital. The question of whether he'll come back, in fact, is always at some level hanging in the air like a dark moth. Remarkably enough, during all that time, across every one of those days, those weeks, those months and those years, Dad never once complained. Not once. Not to me, not to anyone. Now, I found that astonishing at the time, and I find it even more astonishing now, because what Dad did in his silence was not just to simply endure. No, Dad decided on action. At some point during those years, Dad sat down with me, my mum, my sister. Now, I don't remember every word that he said, but I do remember his tone, the seriousness, the worry underneath that tone, the sense that Dad had been carrying this question, this weight, this burden, if you like, and considering this response for a while, and that now Dad had finally decided what to do. He told us he was leaving his safe, secure corporate role, not because of his illness, but because he could go no further. He'd effectively reached a ceiling, and he said something I've never forgotten. He felt his life lacked meaning when he couldn't make progress. A man in his 40s who was seriously disabled, who had every reason in the world to hold on to whatever solidity remained. And yet for Dad, meaning mattered far more. So he and my mum, who was an antiquarian book dealer, well, they went into business together. Dad became an antiquarian map seller. Now those maps were incredibly beautiful as objects, and I don't know why exactly, but perhaps the physical insecurity Dad felt meant that he loved a map that showed a way to navigate the world. Now, for whatever reason Dad loved them, he didn't love modern maps, no. He loved antique maps, hand-coloured, pulled out of atlases centuries old, some of them foxed with blotchy brown watermarks that had aged to paper. Dad would clean and restore them carefully in our bathtub. Dad found a colourist who referenced original colours. Dad found a framer who mounted the maps inside frames of gold and mahogany. Dad learned the history of those maps. He learned the true value of those maps. And over time, he became an expert in his field. And every weekend he took those maps and prints to Portobello Road, where he sold them to tourists occasionally, to collectors, and more often to wily old dealers who descended on Dad's market stall from every conceivable corner of the world. Now, Portobello Road in the 60s was not what you might call a quiet location. It was filled with dropouts, artists, rebels, hippies, with map dealers, with private collectors who flew in from New York and Tokyo and Milan, Munich, and they didn't mind letting you know the effort they'd made. Our neighbours in the market, they sold Chinese vases, antique vases, a friendly enough couple who got to their stand at 4 o'clock in the morning because there was at that time in London a bylaw that if you dealt in stolen goods in that area before sunrise you couldn't be prosecuted. This was nothing like the relatively safe environment of a nationalised industry, and Dad absolutely loved it. His eyes lit up. He opened the stand keenly. He had his newspaper and his coffee beside him. He loved the dealing, the expertise, every aspect of it. Now, Dad would sometimes leave at lunchtime and I'd be left to sell. I was about 11 and I've made a video about that. I'll put a link to it down in the description. But the dealers who came to the stand, well, in Dad's absence, they treated me ruthlessly, and I learned more about selling in those lunch times than I really learned anywhere else for the next 20 years. Vincent Price once visited the stand and made a humorous offer to marry my sister, who was only 12 at the time. Those were indeed the 60s. What Dad did was to expand beyond the crazy confines of Portobello Road. He arranged for kidney dialysis in city hospitals across America, in Israel, in Europe, not so his illness could be managed, so his illness wouldn't prevent him from travelling, from building, from living the life of freedom that he had chosen. He created, long before the phrase had ever been invented, a side hustle, and then he made it his main hustle, his entire working life. So, What does it cost you to stay in a life that's stopped making room for you to grow? Dad knew the cost. He knew it as the government dismantled his economic plans. He knew it from the viewpoint of a hospital bed. He knew it in his body, in his mind, and in his heart long before he told us, his family. When he finally named it, sitting down with us, serious, certain, he didn't focus on being brave. He didn't dwell too much on the risks he was taking because he knew his life lacked meaning because he couldn't make progress. That's not the language of courage. That's the language of someone who's done the accounting and added up that staying still will cost far more than moving. The security that Dad left was never really as solid as it might appear from the outside, with a grand 6th-floor office overlooking Grosvenor Square in London. Governments had been shaking Dad's security for years. Dad's kidneys had been knocking on the door of uncertainty for years too. The security that most of us hold on to, it may not be so solid either. Now that's not a reason to abandon things necessarily, but it is a reason to look more clearly into the mirror when we're holding up that mirror of who we truly are and what we truly want. Dad didn't wait for perfect conditions. He arranged to make them happen. The thing I keep coming back to, it wasn't so much his courage or his leap, impressive though that really was, but it was more the practicality of his arrangements. He found out which cities in the world offered dialysis. He planned ahead. He travelled the world despite and not because of his disability. There was no more glass ceiling and he could make progress again. Now, if you find yourself asking some version of Dad's question, what does it cost you to stay? What would it mean to move? But you don't know what your arrangements would look like? Well, that's exactly the conversation I can have with you. Send me a message or send me an email. Like my dad, we can look at the risks and we can look at the potential for growth. We can see if indeed we can work out what your arrangements would really look like. Now, next week I want to tell you about a boy I went to school with. His name was Scott. He had thick blonde hair and even thicker glasses. He was by far the shyest child in the class. And when the teacher asked us what we wanted to be when we grew up, well, Scott was the only one in the class who knew with absolute certainty. Until next week, ponder the question, have you reached your ceiling? What do you need in order to once again feel progress in your work and in your life?